Voiceover and voice acting in Fire Emblem is bad for the series and bad for the game, and is that enough of an inflammatory statement to get your interest? Because good, we're having a discussion here today about a thought that I've kind of been mulling over for the past few weeks as I've been playing more of Fire Emblem Engage, finishing up my maddening mode run, all that type of stuff. And it really crystallized for me as I was working on getting some footage in a new run that I'm doing off stream for some interesting build ideas and stuff. And I've kind of come to that conclusion that, yeah, I don't want there to be voice acting and voiceover in Fire Emblem for a specific reason. We're going to talk about that. Voiceover and voice acting in video games is a topic that comes up a lot as kind of an expected feature that people want to see in their games in the modern era. It's something that I've seen come up a lot talking about the Pokemon games, how it's somehow wrong or bad that they don't have voice acting in them. And then on the flip side, I've seen a lot of people excited about the fact that we have full voice acting in Fire Emblem nowadays. I figure it's worth comparing Fire Emblem to Pokemon, and especially in their most recent releases with Engage and Scarlet and Violet, because there's a bar for quality between those two releases that's pretty self-apparent. Don't really have to defend my stance there, saying that Engage is good and Scarlet and Violet are not quite so good in terms of actual game construction, functionality, all that type of stuff. But I've seen a lot of discussion again that Scarlet and Violet would be better if they had voice acting, and I don't agree with that statement. First of all, because I personally am of the belief that not every game needs to have voice acting and voiceover just in general. It's just not needed all the time. There's times where I'd much rather a game doesn't have voice acting actually, so that I can just read text and apply voices myself. But also because it wouldn't fix what's broken about Scarlet and Violet, and in fact may have made it worse because it would have taken resources away from the rest of the game that desperately needed all the help that it could get. And I feel like that's something that needs to be talked about. And we're going to talk about it with Engage because there's so much voiceover in Engage. There's so much. I was thinking about this last night as I was going around and trying out some different characters and using some different emblems with characters that I hadn't used on them before and all that type of stuff. And it really hit home the fact that there are so many permutations of lines for every stinking character in Fire Emblem Engage. The script is massive, not just in terms of the actual story script and supports, which are all voice acted, of course, but even just in combat barks. When a character has their own kill lines when they're not wounded, when they're wounded, when they avoid an attack, when they miss an attack, when another character comes in and secures a kill with a backup attack, a character has a specific voice line. Then you consider emblems. When they're engaged, every single character has lines that are lines from the emblems that they're engaged with from their own series that they say, that they voice. And there's multiple lines per emblem, and every single character needs to have their own rendition of those lines because every single character can engage with every single emblem. So the amount of voice work that has gone into all of this, again, with supports, with the actual voiced main script, with every in-combat line, with every combat line that you get when you're engaged, it's huge. And then you extrapolate that out to multiple languages. I don't know how many different languages there's actual VO for Engage. Obviously, I know there's at least Japanese and English. But that just doubles down on so much time and effort and work and money. Translation, new voice work, voice directing, finding voice talent, all that type of stuff. It's a massive quantity of work. And when I'm sitting and thinking about it, and this is coming from someone who's been playing Fire Emblem now for, I don't even know. I truly don't know how long. When did Sacred Stones come out? 2004, I think? My memory is terrible, but a long, long time, almost 20 years. It's a recent phenomena that Fire Emblem games are fully voiced. And while I do enjoy it, I remember a time when Fire Emblem games weren't voiced. And I feel like there's a benefit to that from a game design standpoint. Because if you think about all that time and effort and money and resources that goes into making the voiceover and the voice work happen and having it be of a high acceptable quality, you can't help but think about how those resources could be applied elsewhere. Could the 3D models and 3D animations and everything in something like Three Houses or Engage be higher quality if there was more resources put towards them? Maybe. We do have the limitations of the Switch to consider, but still. I mean, clearly Engage was a big step up graphically over Three Houses, so there's room to work within the atmosphere of the Switch. More resources could probably help with that. I mean, you look at something like Tears of the Kingdom, that game looks beautiful, even though it's running on the Switch. There's a lot that could probably be done within a Fire Emblem game if there was more being put towards the graphics. Same thing with gameplay and balancing and new gameplay features and all that type of stuff. Like, I would rather see more unique models, for example, in Engage for different characters engaged with different emblems, instead of what we have now, which is still really cool, but you kind of fall into, like, is this character a armored unit, a mounted unit, a flying unit? What are the other permutations? Like a caster or a infantry unit, basically. And that class designates what their engaged form is going to look like beyond basically the color scheme that matches the emblem at hand. That's essentially what happens, right? And I would rather see more time and resources put towards making new models that are more unique. Maybe a character with Sigurd specifically has some specific flair and things like that. And if that exists and I just haven't noticed it, then fair enough. But I feel like there's so much detail and innovation and extrapolation of existing things that could happen if all of that time and money wasn't being put towards voiceover. It's kind of the whole thought process for me. Because again, you look back at just how much stuff there is in Engage. I mean, the Somniel. Characters have specific lines when you're cooking, when you're fishing, when you're doing the push-up minigame, or when you're just walking around and characters greet you. There's birthday lines, and there's lines for all of the merchants, and there's so much stuff. And it's not needed. I could see something like a story-based game. You know, you go and look at Sony and all of their huge cinematic, narratively driven, character driven games like your Horizons and your God of Wars and all that type of stuff. Or even things like Metal Gear Solid. You know, so much of those games, their impact comes from the character acting and from the voicing of lines and the storytelling. But something like Fire Emblem, that at its core is a turn-based strategy RPG in some form or fashion. You know, there's different permutations. It doesn't need to convey its story that way because it's not the point. The story and the characterization of these characters is important. There's a reason that supports are as big of a part of the game as they are. But to me, you can get just as much emotional impact and relevant story detail across via text as you can with voice acting. There's a reason that books have been so popular for so long, right? And yeah, there's audiobooks, there's an argument to be made for that, but people are able to take the text that they see and turn it into emotional reaction, into happiness, sadness, excitement, humor, whatever. And if there's a situation at hand, and I'm not a game dev, obviously, I'm not sitting there at the offices of Nintendo or of Intelligent Systems or whatever and saying, okay, here's what your budget is. You've spent $3 million on voiceover. Can we take those resources and put them into the other aspects of the game to make a more solid base mechanical gameplay experience? I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. But it kind of stands to reason logically that resources on a project that are going to one thing could conceivably go to another equally important, if not more important thing, right? So in a situation like this where the voiceover is secondary, or even I would say tertiary, to the rest of the gameplay experience, it feels like a disservice to put stuff towards adding that, when I feel like there's room to improve the actual base mechanics, which is why presumably most people are there. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who disagree with me on this. There's going to be a lot of people that's like, well, I mean, there's no reason that all of these things shouldn't exist. Just do better. And fair enough. You can make that argument. But I still feel that there's almost been too much focus recently on adding voice work to all games that don't necessarily need it, and that it can, and I think definitely has, detracted from the experience in different places. Does that mean that I dislike the voice work in Engage, that I think it's bad, that it shouldn't be there because it's bad? Not at all. Not at all. And I'm sure there's probably some people, some of you listening right now, who've come to that conclusion, but that's not how I feel. I do really actually like the voice work in Engage. I think it's really solid. There's characters that have, in part, solidified their place in my heart and in my love for the game due to their voice work. One of my things that I loved about Boucheron so much that turned me on to the fact that he's actually a really good unit when I had initially dropped him was because I loved his character and his voice work so much. Louis is another great example. Excellent voice work. Even female Allier, I love her lines throughout the game. There's a lot of examples. Yunaka, another fantastic example. It's not to say that that stuff is bad and that it didn't add something to the game. But, to me, I think it would be more important to not focus on putting that level of effort into things and put it into the rest of the game. And maybe that's the case. Maybe Intelligent Systems designed the whole thing from the ground up, got all the combat systems in place, got all the dialogue actually written, got all the graphical systems figured out, got the difficulty balancing figured out, and then added the voice work in. I don't know. Maybe they did. Who knows? Again, I'm not a game dev. I'm not a fly on the wall in their office. But I think there is a discussion to be had there. Going back to the Pokemon example with Scarlet and Violet, again, like, would having voices have made that game better? No. It probably would have been just as jank, if not worse, and it probably would have made the games run worse than they already do. So I think there's an argument to be made here that not every game needs voice work. Hell, look back at things like the indie scene, where you've got games like Fell Seal, Arbiter's Mark, Dark Deity, Symphony of War, the Nephilim Saga, all of these games that have good characters, good story, compelling writing in different ways and forms and fashions. None of them have voice acting because they're small indie projects. That not once took away from the game for me. And I'm glad that rather than trying to get voice work in there that was not really needed, there's a little bit here and there in some of them, but not like a fully voiced script. Not having that, I do think, was to their benefit. Finally, we can look at something like Tactics Ogre Reborn, where the voice work that they did for that game compared to Let Us Cling Together did absolutely elevate the experience. I'm not going to dispute that. I'm glad that the voice work that they have is in Tactics Ogre Reborn because it is phenomenal. The issue is that Tactics Ogre Reborn is like the fourth iteration of the same game. They have had time since the Super Nintendo release to refine and innovate and tweak and add content and make the game itself as good as they could, coming to a point decades later down the line where they have a new version of it coming out, and now one of the big selling features is they've added full voice acting. And they could focus on that, because the rest of the game was basically already there and had already been near perfectly refined. I know there's issues that people have with Reborn, but not what I'm talking about here. So it's a different type of scenario, right? If we take something like, say, Genealogy of the Holy War, which I'm adamant is still going to be getting a remake, add full voice acting to that, that's fine. Because the base game as it exists. They can build off of that, much like with Tactics Ogre. That's what we saw with Shadows of Valencia. That's a remake of Fire Emblem 2 of Gaiden. The base game existed, and there's a whole lot of stuff they tweaked and changed about that game. Absolutely. It's not like it wasn't rebuilt from the ground up, but they still had that baseline to work from. So adding things like voice acting is a lot easier, I would imagine, from a management of the project standpoint. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. I would rather never have voice acting in a new release Fire Emblem again, and make sure that all that time and money and resources and effort is going into making the base game as good as they can. That's kind of the conclusion that I've come to. It's not to say that voice acting is bad in Engage or just in games in general. There's absolutely times where it's not just good, but vital. And it is something that I enjoy. But I think there's a time and a place. And that time and place is not all the time. So let me know your thoughts. I know this is one that's probably going to spark a lot of discussion. It's not about the gameplay of Fire Emblem, but I know people do like to have discussions about this type of stuff. And sometimes it's fun to throw a little bit of a hot take out there too, because I'm pretty sure I'm in the minority on this one, but we'll see. Let me know in the comments what you guys have to say about all this. Whether you agree or disagree, all I ask is that you keep it civil and understanding that people have different opinions, and no one's trying to hurt anyone or say you're bad or anything. Like, it's fine if you feel the way that you do. So, that said, I'm going to call this one here. Guys, thank you all so much for watching. I do very much appreciate it. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.